Return of the Obra Dinn is a game in the continuing series of games I can't really talk about because, playing them is kind of the whole point. Much like games like Outer Wilds or Undertale. If you know, you know. But at its core, it's a puzzle game where you play as an insurance agent who is returning to the eponymous ship. The Obra Dinn is a ghost ship, which in this context means that it left from its destination and never arrived where it was going. The game starts with a short foreword of somebody telling you to investigate the ship, and you quickly find your way there and onto the deck, only to discover that you really can't access most of it, the only thing remaining a single corpse on the ground. You head back to the dinghy to pick up a logbook and a weird-looking pocket watch. With no other real leads, you make your way back to the corpse, which is when this happens.
Captain! Open the door! Kick it in. Lest we break it down and take more than those shells!
You bastards may take exactly what I give you!
Oh nice, that dude got punked. After looking around for a moment, you exit from the memory and back onto the ship, only to discover that one of the doors that was closed before is now open. From there, you can access another memory.
Where are they? Must be in here someplace.
They're at the bottom of the sea.
That's a lie.
God damn, that guy just got... Wow, he's dead. So this is the basic principle of Return of the Obra Dinn. You're given the opportunity to see a few moments before somebody dies, and then record exactly who they are, how they died, and who killed them. The tricky part here is that you can always more or less figure out how somebody died, but not who killed them or even who they are. In order to figure out the identity of an overwhelming majority of the passengers, you will have to use clues from other people's deaths in order to determine it. The game will be nice enough to lock in your guesses if you correctly determine 3 of them in any order, but beyond that you're on your own. And if this looks interesting to you, you should probably just stop the video now and check it out yourself, because at this point, I'm going to be going into the nitty-gritty. As I mentioned, a number of the deaths in the game will refer to people specifically. One of the very first in the game you see pretty much just goes out of its way to tell you exactly who's in the scene. But this is pretty rare. You can determine exactly how hard somebody's going to be to guess by a symbol that's written next to their picture. 1 star means somebody probably refers to them by name, 2 stars requires a bit of guesswork using some of the other materials in the logbook, and 3 star is basically impossible to guess without getting everybody around them first. You can blind guess to figure out which ones are which, but since you have to guess 60 different passengers on the ship, blind guessing is only going to get you so far. And this is where I think the game really kind of breaks down. I was able to guess about 40 of the passengers with some trial and error, but by the time I reached that mark, all I really had left were those 3-star individuals. And the only way I could really figure them out was to basically just brute force with the information I had left. I don't know, maybe I'm just stupid. Probably. It's probably that. It's weird too to me because there are a lot of good context clues in the game, so maybe I just missed something. There's this one guy in the hat, like right at the beginning of the game, and I swear to God, I could not figure this guy out for the longest time. It was absolutely agonizing, because this dude kills like 9 people on the ship. It's crazy. Like, what an absolute badass. And as far as I can tell, I couldn't figure out how to identify this person at all. It was completely nuts to me. And this is probably one of my first hang-ups with the game. Determining the cause of death usually is pretty easy, but finding out who killed somebody can take you, in some cases, most of the game. And speaking of deaths, sometimes those aren't terribly clear either, and I don't blame the game for that. It's clear to me there's a consistent logic with how the deaths are supposed to be determined, but figuring that logic out can be very difficult at first. To illustrate my point, I'm going to spoil 2 deaths on the ship. The first is a scene that you'll actually see right at the beginning of the game. It's a scene where a man is shot and executed in a firing line, which is illustrated in your book as the artist on the ship literally drew it. This is one of the few scenes where the person getting killed is named, and actually it probably gives the most names out of any scene, which means it's one of the rare examples where you can determine who was killed and how they died right away. You hear the captain give the order to a man named Mr. Wolf, and he orders the firing squad to make the shot. When you look in the menu, there's no death by firing squad entry. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think the correct cause of death for this man is? Go ahead and take note of what you think it is, and we'll get back to that in a second. This is another scene in the game where the ship is getting attacked by some horrible creature from the deep. You hear a conversation where somebody lights up a cannon, but the monster's attack causes the ship to slide and tilts the cannon inwards, firing at 2 people. There is an entry in the logbook for death by cannon, but it requires that you pick who shot them. So I want to ask you again, who do you think caused these people's deaths? Was it the person who ordered the lighting of the cannon, or was it the person who lit the cannon, accidentally setting off the chain of events that would get them killed? Well, here's the thing, it's not either of them. What the game wants you to write in the logbook is that it was the beast. The beast attacking the ship caused the cannon to tilt, which caused the people to die. Which means the entry for these people's deaths is supposed to read, person was shot by a cannon by a beast. Going back to the firing squad example, it's the same thing. The person the game wants you to count as responsible for the firing squad's death is not the captain who gave the order, or the man who literally told them to fire, but rather it was one of the people in the firing line. I'm kinda mad I didn't figure this one out, because when you look at it, it's actually a really nice moment. Since you can see the bullet lines in the diorama, you can see whose bullet actually entered the man's body, and this is supposed to be who's responsible. It's a really nice aha moment, but unfortunately it's peppered by this kind of weird logic. What you can determine from these moments is that the game is not interested in who's responsible for a person's death, but who is literally the one who pulled the trigger on them. Intention doesn't matter, it's just about who physically did the deed. Like I said, it's consistent, but it's not very clear. Luckily, these are the worst examples in the game, but this is not the only time it happens. Multiple times in the game I was confused, not because I couldn't figure out how somebody died, but because I wasn't sure how the game wanted me to report it. There were several entries I was sitting on most of the game where I'd had all the information filled out, but I wasn't sure if I was fitting the game's logic for what it actually wanted. I eventually caved after getting frustrated and ended up looking up 2 of the passengers, not because I was completely stumped on deciphering the information, but because I wanted to see I was on the right track. And this makes me really mad because I really didn't want to cheat on this game, but it just felt really unfair. Feel free to judge me in the comments. Another thing that ended up irritating me was the amount of time it takes after you see somebody's death scene for the first time. I think the game works really well when you get that nice pop moment after a dialogue, and you get to see exactly how gruesome a fate somebody ended up getting. But before you can move on and take your guesses and write down your notes, you have to wait up to 50 seconds for the diorama to finish playing its music and move on. This is further compounded by the fact that going into the menu also pauses this timer as well. Not only can you not leave the scene, but you also can't write down how the person in the death scene actually died. You have to wait for the music to stop every single time. I assume this was designed so that you would appreciate the initial pop of the death, and I really think this is one of the game's best tools. But after that initial moment and soaking up as much information and different people in the scene, that appeal starts to drag a bit, especially once you realize you're going to have to go through one of these for almost every crewmate on the ship. I feel like at the very least you should be able to look at the person who died in that scene, if not cut that time that you have to wait down by at least half, or give the option to skip the dialogue so that you can have it play over the scene normally, which is funny because that's exactly what happens after you've seen the scene once. Another thing that bothered me is that there's no fast way to revisit death scenes. By the end of the game, the ship is littered by dozens of corpses, and it can actually be very difficult to find exactly which memory you want to go back into. I'm aware that the logbook will tell you exactly where to go if you look it up, but what I'm looking for is something that you can have so you can jump right to the memory at any time. I feel like it wouldn't have been much to give you an option to jump directly to the memory from the logbook, but I get that that would have probably broken things if you could jump to any scene at any time, especially if you were in the middle of jumping between other death scenes that chain one to another. But it would have been nice as a feature that unlocked at least after you've seen all the scenes on the ship. Or maybe it was there and I just missed it. I don't know, I'm stupid. Speaking of the end of the game, it's actually surprisingly easier to figure out a lot of the deaths after you've seen all the scenes. No duh, right? The game will go out of its way to tell you if you have all the information necessary to solve somebody's identity, but it can be surprisingly difficult to figure out somebody specifically without already solving a number of people around them. But it almost feels like the game wants you to try to guess people's identity while you're seeing their scenes. It just so happens that with the benefit of hindsight, you can look at things in a different perspective. But I think this kind of ruins some of the fun of the game. Figuring stuff out as it pops up really is the best fun you'll get in Obra Dinn. And it actually surprised me how many people I had left once I'd reached that point near the end of the game. But this isn't to say that the game is actually making it difficult for you to figure things out until later. On the contrary, it's actually surprisingly riddled with a lot of info right in plain sight. One of my favorite moments in the game was looking at the beginning of the book and noticing that the person who sent you to the ship wrote their name at the end of the letter. Sure enough, if you check the ship docket, you'll notice that that name is actually on the ship, which means that not only is that person on the ship somewhere, although you don't know what they look like, but that they actually got away from the ship and are still alive, which is a great hint that not everybody in the logbook is necessarily dead. And there are often a lot of good clues like this that are hidden in plain sight. By checking the illustration and the map of the ship, you can determine a lot of people simply by where they happen to keep appearing in the cutscenes. One that really stood out to me was this one where they're in the doctor's office. There are 4 men discussing somebody dying from the plague, and considering the register on the ship says that there is a surgeon and the surgeon's mate, it's not hard to assume that at least one of the people in that office is going to be the surgeon. Many of these clues are readily apparent even if you don't realize they're there. Something as simple as looking at the picture that the game gives you can reveal a tremendous amount of details that can completely give away a person's identity. Something as simple as the position people are sitting in the picture or what clothes they're wearing can allow you to determine somebody who is otherwise completely impossible to guess. While the game does beat you over the head with some of these clues, a lot more of them are really subtle, which is great, since it makes you feel like you're really rewarded for paying attention. A good puzzle doesn't need to be difficult in order to be rewarding, it just needs to make the player feel smart for completing it, and this really fits that to a T. I found myself stopping fairly regularly when playing Obra Dinn because I would often get too caught up in some of the most obvious details, and I think that's okay. It's very easy to get caught into a mood where you just constantly jump between the different death scenes, or it feels like you're only really getting the death cause and nothing else. And this works pretty well, most of the time. Again, I think some of those death causes are a little bullshit, but with the benefit of hindsight, you can look back and realize that most of that information isn't too hard to figure out. Again, aside from those 3-star people who are pretty much trial and error as far as I could tell. The plot of Obra Dinn is told in reverse. The very first cutscene you see is actually one of the last in the game. It's chapter 10 of 10. And it's kind of strange to me because this is one of the few scenes in the game that's actually told in chronological order. Many more of the chapters in the game are told with you getting the end of the story and having to work your way back through the chapter, which is probably why it's so hard to wrap your head around some of the clues. Most of the other chapters in the game are told in reverse, and this can kind of be hard to get used to. More often than not, I would end up looking for clues from the previous murder rather than the one I was in because I had to work my way back through a corpse that was already established in the scene. And it's easy to miss a lot of clues because of this. It compounds with the issue of you having to wait to fill in death details for somebody. More often than not, when you're wandering the ship after determining a cause of death, it encourages you to look around and see all the carnage and potentially look towards your next death. Or previous, since it technically happens place before that one. And again, this is another problem that's solved with the benefit of hindsight. A lot of these look visually immaculate when you first see them, but you're going to tend to miss a lot of details your first time through, either from the radical death or because you're looking for the next corpse. And again, I don't know if I can really blame the game for this, but it's true that undoubtedly it's more fun to try to discover the mystery during the death scene rather than 5 hours later when you're flipping through the logbook trying to brute force a lot of the identities. The reason these scenes are told in reverse is one of practicality. A lot of the people who died on the ship aren't there anymore, so in order to reach a lot of the corpses, you have to go through a previous memory. This often means that the scene you get will be at the end of the chapter, when a bunch of people have already died. That way, it gives you a lot of opportunities to hop back through previous corpses. I understand why they presented the scenes in this way, but not if the difficulty was intentional on the part of the developer. Maybe they presented these non-chronologically intentionally to raise the difficulty of guessing them, but I get the feeling that it was largely unintentional. Return of the Obra Dinn. Oh god, I hope I didn't say Return to the Obra Dinn. I feel like I made that mistake at least once, I don't know. Is one of those gem indie games that really fulfills a very particular niche. It's a murder mystery puzzle game that has a good blend of logical puzzle solving and spectacular pop-off moments of outrageous but very tasteful gore. That's elegantly obfuscated by the wonderful art style. I kind of hated this game while I was playing it, but that's actually a good thing. Most of the games I really enjoy, I end up kind of loathing while I'm playing them. Some of my favorite games, I end up pointing out a lot of the flaws in while I'm playing them because I'm trying to find faults to pick them apart, because I'm enjoying them otherwise. And for me at least, is the surefire signifier that I actually really like it. I can't really explain it much beyond that, but hopefully you get what I mean. I've always felt like love and hate are two sides of the same coin. People who really love something can hate something much stronger. So the more you really enjoy something, the easier it is to pick apart. I was thinking about whether or not I'd want to play another game like this, and I think honestly the answer is no. The visual style of Obra Dinn definitely is a very unique draw, but it's not just that replicating that art style wouldn't make it unique. Rather, I think this concept kind of holds up on its own and doesn't really need to be elaborated on. I'm torn on this. On the one hand, I did like Obra Dinn, but I feel like if you did this same puzzle structure again, it wouldn't hit quite as hard. It's very important to me that games like this continue to exist. These kinds of weird niche games that aren't necessarily for everyone. You'll need to forgive me because I'm going to make the cardinal sin of comparing this game to Dark Souls, but one of the reasons I always enjoyed Dark Souls 1 specifically, and not some of the newer ones, was because they fulfilled a very particular niche. When Demon Souls came out, it was originally a very clunky, awkward, hard to control, slow series with very punishing difficulty. But as the series went on and they made more and more of these types of games, they ended up being polished to a sheen that allowed them to refine the combat and make them much more hyper-intense. As a result of this direction and refinement, they ended up becoming something with greater mass appeal because they gained the traits of a lot of other modern action games. Or maybe other games stole from them and then they stole it back. It's weird. Video games have always had a long history of stealing things from one another, so it's not really clear. Whatever. But the thing is, I don't like modern Souls games. But not because they're not good, it's because they don't fulfill the same niche that existed when the first original series came out. It's like if my favorite brand of ice cream suddenly added walnuts to it. It's not that I don't like walnuts, but the reason I bought it in the first place was because it was just vanilla. And when I look at Return of the Obra Dinn, I'm overwhelmed with an appreciation for these very niche, well-executed concepts. It may not be vanilla ice cream, but maybe something more like a fancy imported caramel that comes in those bags where you only get a couple of them. I don't know, this analogy's kind of breaking down, but you get what I'm going for. Obra Dinn is not a perfect puzzle game by any means, but it is one that I'm very happy exists. The experience is much like building a ship in a bottle. You take your time to painstakingly assemble the pieces that you're given, probably walk away frustrated a few times because the tools you're given don't always work quite right, but by the end you can sit back and appreciate the final product. My name is Seirvox, and thank you very much for listening. I want to give special thanks to viewer Chimerat, I hope I'm saying that right, for gifting me this game. If there's something you'd like me to take a look at in the future, or you have your own opinions on Return of the Obra Dinn, please leave a comment below. It gives me the motivation I need to keep making more reviews. I'm not really sure if people really like these or not, but I'm gonna keep making them, goddammit. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.